In the far north, there are places where silence becomes physical. Snow swallows sound. Trees stand so still they look dead even when they aren't. The sky hangs low and pale, like a ceiling pressing down on everything beneath it. In those places, winter doesn't arrive suddenly. It settles in, slowly, until movement itself feels like a mistake. That was where he lived. No one knew when he arrived. There were no records, no sightings that could be dated with certainty. Only signs, traps appearing along frozen rivers, pelts showing up in distant settlements without explanation. Rumors passed quietly between people who knew better than to ask questions. Someone was out there, and he knew the land too well. The traps were what finally drew attention. They weren't sloppy or desperate. They were precise, carefully set, maintained through storms that buried entire forests. Whoever placed them understood animal behavior, weather patterns, and the way snow concealed metal beneath its surface. It wasn't survival, it was routine. Authorities received complaints late in the season. Illegal trapping in protected territory, far beyond the last maintained road. Normally, enforcement would wait until spring. Winter travel was dangerous, expensive, and rarely worth it. But something about this case felt different, so they sent 2 officers. They traveled by sled along a frozen river that cut through endless forest. The temperature hovered around 30 degrees C. Their breath crystallized in the air. The world was colorless. White snow, gray sky, black trees stripped bare by cold. After 2 days, they saw it, a cabin. Low to the ground, almost hidden, half buried by drifting snow as if it had been built to disappear. Smoke rose faintly from a thin pipe. Someone was inside. The officers called out. Nothing. They stepped closer, boots creaking on ice. That's when the gunshot cracked through the silence. The bullet struck the ice near their feet, exploding shards upward. Another shot followed almost immediately, closer this time, not wild, not panicked. Deliberate, the officers dove for cover, shouting commands. They never saw his face, only movement. Dark fabric against darker trees, a shape slipping between trunks with unnatural ease. He fired again, forcing them back. And then he was gone. By the time reinforcements arrived days later, the cabin was empty. No food, no tools, no bedding. Everything removable had been taken. Outside, a single line of footprints led away from the cabin. North, into land where winter killed quickly. The search began with confidence and ended in disbelief. Trackers followed his trail across frozen rivers, over ridges, through forests battered by wind. He traveled light, too light, no sled marks, no snowshoes, sometimes no clear boot prints at all. He moved fast, faster than trained men with dogs. The temperature dropped further, 40, then colder. Storms rolled in without warning, erasing tracks hours after they were made. Planes were brought in, circling the white emptiness below. Once, briefly, a pilot spotted a dark speck crossing open snow. When they turned back, it was gone. Search teams rotated out as frostbite set in. Dogs collapsed. Supplies dwindled. Still, the trail continued. He did not slow. He traveled during blizzards, at night, across exposed ground where shelter didn't exist. He chose routes that avoided deep snow, crossed rivers at their strongest points, followed terrain that minimized wind exposure. He wasn't running blindly. He was navigating. After weeks, the trackers found where he slept, if it could be called sleep. A shallow depression carved into snow beside a rock face, lined with branches. No fire pit, no insulation, no warmth. He had slept there without fire, in temperatures that killed unprepared people in minutes. That realization unsettled everyone. Fire was life in winter, and he had rejected it. Smoke revealed position. Heat left traces. Fire made you visible. Cold did not. From that point on, the manhunt changed. It was no longer about capturing him. It was about understanding what kind of person could live like this. After more than a month, the trail finally ended. They found him near a riverbank, partially sheltered by trees. He had collapsed mid-movement, as if his body simply stopped obeying him. He was dead. He was shockingly thin. Barely any fat remained. His clothing was minimal, patched, repaired repeatedly, worn far beyond its intended lifespan. His gear was primitive, handmade, efficient. There were no signs of panic. No signs of struggle, just exhaustion. An autopsy later confirmed what many already suspected. starvation, exposure, and organ failure. His body had been operating beyond human limits for weeks, and then came the final mystery. No identification, no fingerprints on record, no matching reports of missing persons, no name, no origin. He had lived in one of the most unforgiving environments on Earth, and survived longer than trained search teams sent to find him. He had fired on officers, vanished into winter, and nearly won. The case was quietly closed. Official reports used careful language. They avoided speculation. They avoided questions they couldn't answer. But among those who tracked him, the story never really ended. They still talk about his footprints, about how he moved during storms, about how winter didn't seem to slow him. It seemed to protect him. And sometimes, when the north goes quiet and the snow falls just right, people still say the land remembers him. The man who didn't fight winter, the man who didn't fear it, the man who outran it. In the age when the poles were still blank spaces on maps, exploration was driven less by certainty than by confidence. Men crossed oceans on wooden ships, trusted compasses that froze, and relied on theories that had never been tested in the places that mattered most. This expedition was built on one such theory, that technology could conquer ice, that the wind could be trusted, that the Arctic, vast, empty, and indifferent, could be crossed not by endurance but by invention. 3 men departed into the polar unknown with the full attention of the world behind them. Newspapers followed every step of their preparation. Donors celebrated the elegance of the plan. Spectators gathered to watch the launch. The craft rose slowly into the pale sky, and then, almost immediately, everything began to go wrong. The idea was simple, at least on paper. Rather than battle ice and terrain on foot, the explorers would float above it. A hydrogen balloon, massive and graceful, would carry them across the frozen sea. Wind currents would guide them toward the pole. Navigation would be minimal, physical exertion nearly non-existent. They packed food, weapons, scientific instruments, cameras, journals. Enough supplies, they believed, for months. What they didn't pack was a way out. Once airborne, they were committed. No engines, no steering, only rope, canvas, gas, and hope. When the balloon lifted, cheers echoed across the ice. The men waved from the basket below. The wind caught the craft gently at first, pulling it northward over endless white. Within hours, problems appeared. The balloon leaked. Hydrogen escaped through seams that had tested fine in warmer climates. The gas contracted in the cold. The balloon lost lift. To compensate, the men threw equipment overboard. Sandbags, supplies, anything with weight. They were descending, and they were drifting. After less than 3 days, the balloon scraped the ice. Then struck it, then collapsed. The Arctic swallowed the craft without ceremony. The march they survived the crash, that alone felt like success. The balloon lay torn and useless across the ice, fabric snapping in the wind like a wounded animal. The men salvaged what they could: guns, food, notebooks, instruments. They were alive, but now they were walking. Their maps were optimistic sketches. The ice beneath their feet wasn't land, but drifting sea ice, constantly shifting, breaking, reforming. Progress in one direction could be erased overnight by the slow movement of the frozen ocean. Still, they marched. They hauled sleds loaded with supplies across ridged ice, over pressure cracks that opened without warning. Sometimes they advanced miles in a day. Sometimes they woke to discover they had drifted backward while sleeping. The cold was relentless. It penetrated clothing, seeped into bone, numbed fingers until simple tasks became dangerous. Writing hurt, breathing burned. They hunted when they could, seals, occasionally polar bears. The meat kept them alive, but it carried a hidden cost. The poison. As weeks passed, something changed. One of the men complained of headaches. Another grew irritable, confused. Their skin darkened strangely. Wounds healed slowly or not at all. Their joints stiffened. They blamed fatigue, cold, stress, but the real cause was invisible. Polar bear liver, rich in vitamin A, was slowly poisoning them. They continued eating it, unaware. Their journals began to reflect it. Entries grew erratic. Measurements became inconsistent, observations contradicted each other, some pages trailed off mid-sentence. They argued over direction, over pace, over nothing at all, yet still they walked the ice cage. Eventually they reached land, or something like it, a barren island of rock and snow rising from the ice. It offered shelter from wind, a sense, however false, of stability. They decided to stay, to recover, to wait for better conditions. They built a camp from stone and canvas, a crude shelter, a final one. Winter tightened its grip. Temperatures dropped further. Darkness stretched longer each day until daylight became a memory. Storms pinned them inside their shelter for days at a time, wind screaming across rock like a living thing. Their food dwindled, their bodies weakened, their minds followed. One man stopped writing entirely, another wrote obsessively, filling pages with lists, fragments, repetitions. The third tried to maintain routine measurements, maintenance, structure, but his handwriting deteriorated until it was barely legible. They were dying, slowly, quietly, without witnesses. The last days there was no final catastrophe, no dramatic collapse, no desperate last stand. One man died in his sleep. The others wrapped his body and placed it outside, unable to bury it in frozen ground. They said nothing about it in their journals. Silence replaced description. Another man followed days later, slumped against the shelter wall, eyes open, expression neutral. The last man lived longest. He wrote until his hands could no longer hold a pencil. His final entries spoke not of fear, but of resignation, of cold, of tiredness, of silence. Then the writing stopped. Discovery decades passed. The world moved on. Wars were fought. Borders shifted. Technologies advanced. The expedition became a footnote, an ambitious failure swallowed by ice. Then, by chance, remains were found, a shelter, bones, tools, journals preserved by cold. When the notebooks were opened, the past breathed again. Scientists read the slow unraveling of human bodies and minds under extreme isolation and cold, the evidence of poisoning, the signs of hypothermia, the quiet acceptance of death. There was no mystery in the end. Only truth. The expedition had not been defeated by ice alone. It had been undone by overconfidence, by trust in theory over reality, by silence mistaken for safety. After today, the Arctic still keeps their final camp frozen in time. Wind scours the rocks, snow drifts through broken shelter walls. Nothing moves except ice. Their names matter less now than their lesson. The polar regions do not negotiate. They do not care about innovation, ambition, or belief. They allow survival only briefly. From above, they appeared calm, soft white ridgelines beneath a pale sky, clouds drifting lazily between peaks. Inside the aircraft, passengers believed the worst of the turbulence had passed. Seatbelts loosened, conversations resumed. No one sensed how close winter already was. Then the plane struck the mountain, metal screamed, the tail tore away, seats ripped loose, bodies were flung into open air. What remained of the fuselage slammed into a frozen slope and slid violently, spinning and breaking apart before stopping in a narrow, high-altitude valley surrounded by walls of snow and rock. When the motion ended, silence rushed in. Those who survived sat stunned amid twisted metal and blood. Streaked snow, the cold arrived immediately, ruthless and precise. Breath burst out in white clouds, fingers numbed within minutes. The wind cut through torn clothing as if it wasn't there. They were alive, but the mountains had already decided how long that would last. The wait at first, hope was automatic. Planes would notice the missing flight. Search teams would come. Rescue was a matter of time. That belief sustained them through the first nights as they pulled the injured from the wreckage and laid the dead outside, unable to look at them for long. They slept pressed together inside the broken fuselage, blocking gaps with luggage and seat cushions. Even so, the cold never loosened its grip. It seeped into bones, into thoughts, into dreams that ended in shivering awakenings. Food was rationed carefully: chocolate, peanuts, crumbs of crackers, sips of alcohol. Each item felt absurdly small against the vast hunger beginning to grow. Days passed, then more days. No aircraft appeared, no distant engines, no signals. They realized the truth slowly, reluctantly. No one knew where they were. Hunger changed them. At first it was a dull ache, then sharp cramps, then a constant presence that narrowed every thought. Conversations drifted back to food again and again, memories of meals, recipes, imagined flavors. Some cried quietly, others grew irritable, snapping at nothing. The bodies outside did not decay. The cold preserved them perfectly. They lay in the snow, unchanged, unmoving, waiting. The idea arrived without a clear beginning. No one wanted to be the first to say it. The thought passed silently between them, heavy and unbearable. The dead were food. When it was finally spoken aloud, the words sounded unreal. People wept, some vomited. Others turned away, refusing to listen. They argued, pleaded, prayed, but winter does not accept prayers. They made rules, no killing, only those who had already died. It was not cruelty, they told themselves. It was survival. Even then, many could not do it, until hunger became stronger than disgust. The first time broke something inside them. The cold made the flesh rigid, hands shook, eyes stayed closed. Tears froze on cheeks, but their bodies responded. Strength returned, thoughts cleared. Winter had taught them its price. The avalanche weeks into their ordeal, the mountains moved. In the middle of the night, a sound like thunder exploded through the valley. Snow and ice roared downward, smashing into the fuselage with crushing force. Walls collapsed, darkness filled with choking powder. Some were buried instantly, unable to scream. Others clawed at packed snow with bare hands, nails tearing, lungs burning. The avalanche ended as suddenly as it began, leaving silence and fewer voices behind. Those who survived dug frantically, pulling out bodies too late, faces frozen in expressions of terror. Hope shattered completely. Winter was no longer waiting. It was actively hunting. The decision after the avalanche, waiting became impossible. Food was nearly gone again. Bodies were fewer. Strength faded quickly in the thin mountain air. Every night felt colder than the last. 2 survivors made the choice. They would walk. They stitched makeshift boots from seat covers, wrapped themselves in layers of fabric and insulation scavenged from the wreckage, and said their goodbyes quietly. No one argued. No one tried to stop them. They stepped into the mountains with no maps, no equipment, and no certainty. Only the knowledge that staying meant death. Behind them, the others watched until the figures disappeared into white. Then they waited. The walkers moved slowly, painfully. Each step sank into deep snow. The altitude burned their lungs. Nights froze their bodies nearly solid. They slept sitting upright, afraid that lying down would be permanent. They crossed ridges where wind threatened to knock them from their feet. They rationed their remaining strength, spoke little, and focused only on the next step. Behind them, those left at the wreckage faded one by one. Some died in their sleep. Others lost consciousness and never woke. The fuselage grew quieter. Rescue against all odds, the walkers survived. After days of agony, they stumbled into civilization. Thin, bearded, barely recognizable as human. At first, people did not believe them. Then authorities listened. Helicopters returned to the mountains. What rescuers found stunned the world. Living survivors, skeletal, traumatized, barely holding on to life. Frozen remains, evidence of a choice that made headlines but lost its meaning once removed from cold, hunger, and isolation. The survivors were judged, they were questioned, they were whispered about. But those who had been there knew the truth. There had been no madness, no savagery, only winter. After years later, many survivors spoke rarely of the mountains. Some never did. Those who tried struggled to explain a reality no one wanted to understand. That hunger rewrites morality, that cold strips life down to its most basic rule. Survive, the mountains remain unchanged, snow still fills the valley. Wind still screams through the peaks. The wreckage is gone, but the place remembers. And when winter settles in, heavy and silent, it reminds the world of a truth older than fear. When the cold takes everything else, survival becomes the only law left standing. And then, eventually, they reclaim everything. The expedition did not vanish in a storm. It did not end in violence. It simply drifted into silence,